And we are live, season 2 of our conversation series. This is conversation number 7, and we have John Bunzl and Gayatri Rokade from Simpol as our guests today. These conversations are brought to you by the Vivekananda Institute for Leadership Development, We Lead, which is a unit of the Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement. These conversations hope to bring speakers and people from a wide range of backgrounds spanning topics of development, social issues, leadership and education, culture, heritage, and much more. And in this conversation, like I said, we have John Bunzl as well as Gayatri. Welcome, both of you. And a brief introduction. John is a political activist with a new and compelling vision for a citizen-driven global cooperation. He champions global cooperation as critical to solving the challenges threatening our planet. John founded the international Simultaneous policy organization, Simpol, in 2002 to encourage citizens to use their national right to vote to drive politicians, parties, and governments towards global cooperation. Since the organization's establishment, Simpol has successfully built a network of citizen supporters in over 100 countries, and politicians in a number of countries support the Simpol campaign. John strongly advocates the importance of the evolutionary worldview to understanding global problems. His specialist expertise is in identifying and resolving both the political, economic, and psychological barriers to global cooperation. John has authored and co-authored 3 books, including The Simpol Solution, People-Centered Global Governance, Monetary Reform, Making It Happen. And a number of John's articles on global governance have been published by the Journal of Integral Theory and Practice. He has lectured widely on global governance, including at the Schumacher Society, the World Trade Organization, the World Academy of Arts and Science. Welcome again, John. And he's joined today by Gayatri. Gayatri is a software engineer by profession who is interested in making a difference to society. And as she says, her purpose in life is to be able to help in whichever small way to bring equality and normalization in this seemingly stable yet chaotic world. So John,
thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation.
It's our pleasure, John. There are a lot of young students also joined today because they were interested. I even spoke to them about. I even asked them if they would be able to understand what all this meant, but they said no, we'll still come and sit. So they're sitting and listening in as we speak. So let's begin at the beginning. In a sense, could you please explain what the Simultaneous policy campaign is, and what it hopes to achieve?
Okay, Simpol is really a general framework for allowing citizens to use their national right to vote to encourage international cooperation. The reason it's called simultaneous policy is because the measures needed to solve global problems, in our view, should be implemented simultaneously by nations. And that sounds slightly crazy when you first hear it, but when you think about it in our globalized world, one of the reasons that global problems are not being solved right now is because no nation wants to move first. To cut carbon emissions, for example, for any nation means higher taxes on business, higher environmental regulations, and so forth, and that will mean higher costs. But if other countries are not implementing the same or similar taxes and restrictions, the jobs and business will go elsewhere. So any nation moving first to any significant degree will harm its economy, and that's why nothing is happening. Well, that's one of the reasons nothing is happening. And if you think about it, that vicious circle, that first mover competitive disadvantage problem applies to a whole number of problems, not just climate change, but to corporate tax levels, to nuclear weapons, to, I mean, you name it, the list of global issues or transnational issues is endless. I mean, COVID is another example where because nations are not acting cooperatively, you get this vaccine nationalism problem. So I think we're generally speaking, we are entering a stage in our evolution, Ramesh, where the nation state can no longer grapple with problems that have kind of escaped the natural ambit of the nation state and has gone up to the global level. And that's why we need a new level of politics. We need a new global political framework. And that's what Simpol is. And the way it works is very simple. Basically, the policy content of Simpol would be designed primarily by citizens when the time comes. But in the meantime, what citizens can do is sign on to the campaign. And by doing so, what you're really saying to your politicians is, I will give strong preference at all national elections to politicians or parties who have pledged to implement the simultaneous policy alongside other governments. So that pledge by citizens, or that commitment by citizens, doesn't require you to vote for a particular politician or party. It just tells politicians that they will be much more likely to get your vote if they've signed the pledge to implement Simpol. And that incentive so far has caused over 100 members of parliament in the UK Parliament who come from all sorts of political parties to sign the Simpol pledge. The election in Germany just completed now. We increased the number of pledged members of parliament from 13 to 40, again coming from across the political spectrum. And Gayatri is our national coordinator in India. She's just started, and we are hoping to get the same process or a similar process running also in India. So the idea, if you like, Ramesh, is to get this process of in principle willingness amongst politicians going in democratic countries, and then non-democratic countries can kind of be added or invited later on down the line. So this process is really an alternative yet complementary way of dealing with global problems. We're not saying countries should stop supporting the United Nations. No, they should carry on. But the United Nations is not looking very promising as a route to solving climate change and other global problems. So Simpol is really offering an alternative that citizens can actually, particularly young people, can get involved in straight away. We don't need to reform any existing institutions. We can just go right ahead and use our votes in the way I described. And that has proven very, very powerful.
So in that sense, just as a follow-up to what you spoke about the COVID situation. And we recently, just a couple of days ago, we saw how, it's the same vaccine that's used in India, Covishield, that is also used across the European Union as well, what used to be the European Union. And you had the UK, coming out with a travel advisory that said Indians traveling to the UK would need a 14-day quarantine, even if they were vaccinated with Covishield. So it's the same AstraZeneca vaccine. And you had the Indian government quickly sending out an advisory saying that all travelers from the UK would necessarily need to quarantine for another 14 days. So this is. So do you think but we also saw in the concerted global response to COVID-19, particularly the pandemic, an example of simultaneous policy? Do you think that, we did see to some extent, governments come together, particularly in terms of addressing the large issues that the pandemic threw up? And also, so do you think that would be an example of how simultaneous policy could potentially work if global leaders, global politicians, and global corporates got together?
Well, I think COVID is certainly an example of the kind of global problem that we are going to increasingly face under a globalized world. I wouldn't say that the government reaction has been an example of a simultaneous policy. I would say it's more the opposite, where they have failed to act in concert.
That's why I brought it up, in fact.
So I think if we had under more of a Simpol approach, I think you would have the underpinning recognition is that we're not safe. Nobody is safe until we are all safe in the world. And under that kind of attitude, we would have had vaccine production sponsored cooperatively in even greater quantities, with much more equitable distribution of the vaccines. Instead of this vaccine nationalism that we've experienced, where Britain and others have sort of hogged, the majority of the supply. So I think it's COVID. Well, to my mind, I don't know about Gayatri, what you think, but to my mind, it's a warning. Things like COVID are saying to the world, and climate change are saying to the world, guys, there are global problems here. If governments don't cooperate, we will not survive. And that's what we really need to realize, I think.
So, let's take climate change. I think that's something that people largely relate to. And if you could use the climate change example and unpack for us what a global simultaneous policy would look like if we looked at the climate change. Because one of the issues, most climate change interventions, one of the stumbling blocks is the fact that developing economies want developed economies who've, had their turn polluting the environment to pay reparations for all that they cost. So how would a simultaneous policy be framed if you could unpack it within the context of, let's say, climate change, for example?
Sure. Well, let me just run through the principles underpinning Simpol, and I think from that you will see the difference between Simpol and the way that the UN is trying to deal with climate change. So the first point about Simpol, which I mentioned before, is that all or sufficient nations would implement emissions reduction measures simultaneously. Because if it's done simultaneously, no nation loses out, everybody maintains their relative competitiveness, it all happens at the same time. Rather like a national law. If a national law is passed in India, it comes into force globally and simultaneously. It applies to the whole of the Indian territory, and it comes into force at a certain specific time, simultaneously across the whole country. The second principle of Simpol is that we would advocate a multi-issue global agreements. One of the problems with the climate change debate is that you're dealing with just one single issue, which is carbon emissions. And of course, on almost any single issue, there will always be some nations that win and others that lose. And the losers, of course, have no incentive to cooperate because they have nothing, there's nothing to compensate them for their loss. Yeah. So one of the second principle of Simpol, which I think applies really strongly to climate change, is that alongside a carbon emissions agreement, you might have a global tax raising agreement. So if the billions that you could raise from a global wealth tax or a global currency transactions tax could then be redistributed on an agreed basis to the countries that have the highest costs to reduce their emissions. And then, if the agreement is sufficiently robust and the tax is high enough, there will be plenty left over to also compensate developing countries who have not been the cause of most of the emissions. So it's a very pragmatic idea. So that what a nation might lose on one issue, it can gain on another. And to me, that seems to be an absolute, obvious ABC necessity if you're going to get agreements that really stick. The third principle of Simpol is that the agreement would consist of measures that are not just targets, but detailed policy measures. One of the problems today is that they agree a target in Paris, or they might agree one in this time in Scotland. But because no nation knows what all the other nations are actually going to do to achieve the target, this fear of competitive disadvantage still continues. So there's just not enough transparency. Under Simpol, you would have that transparency. And the final difference, as I also alluded to earlier with Simpol, is that citizens are using our votes to encourage politicians to sign on to Simpol. With the UN process, by contrast, if nothing gets agreed, there is no political price to pay for politicians. They just turn around and say, oh, well, we did our best and we were trying to protect the national interest and blah, blah, blah. And of course, there is no penalty. There's no electoral penalty to pay for that. Whereas with Simpol, if we have sufficient citizens and politicians know that their future votes might depend on their support for Simpol, then you have a much more robust process towards the global cooperation that we need. So those are the differences, and I think I sometimes think, Ramesh, that with the current process that the UN is following, single issue, not really simultaneous, targets and no details, it's sort of, how could we organize a global negotiation to have the maximum chance of failure? Oh, yes, let's do it like this, And to me, it's just no surprise that it's not working.
I just had one point specifically on this. When you speak about politicians would typically, sign on to something like that if this was a sufficiently strong enough vote bank or other vote block. If there were enough politicians and enough citizens who said that they would cast their vote if and only if their politician or their representative agreed to something like implementing simultaneous policy. So it's vote banks that swing elections today across the globe. And do you think, is that something that you're looking at in terms of looking at structuring Simpol as some sort of a vote bank in terms of ensuring that
to some degree. I mean, what we find, I'll give you an example in a minute, Ramesh, of how it's worked quite often in the UK and in some other elections. But basically, I mean, there are really two reasons why politicians sign on to Simpol. One is, I think, one is that they think that, well, it may help their electoral chances, but often they sign because they think it's a good idea. And we've had many politicians who are sitting in very safe parliamentary seats who have signed up simply because they think it's a good idea and it makes sense. So I think, often you can look on our website for some of the comments that the politicians have made. But I think, politicians, it's not that they don't understand the urgency of these problems. The reason that the thing that's holding them back is this fear of competitive disadvantage. I want to solve climate change. I want to bring in these laws and taxes, but if I can't be sure that our competitor countries will also do the same thing, what am I supposed to do? So it's a very human. It's a fear problem. It's a vicious circle of fear, really. What we found in some elections with this voting process, it's not that we will only vote if. It's really that we will give preference to politicians that have signed the pledge. So if you join Simpol, it doesn't stop you from voting for your preferred party, but it just gives a general message to all the politicians who are competing for our votes that those that sign the Simpol pledge are more likely to receive our vote than not. And what you find, and what we have found in quite a few times in elections, certainly in the UK, is that often parliamentary seats and even entire elections are sometimes won and lost on very fine margins. I mean, we only have to think back to the United States election in 2000 between Al Gore and George Bush, which was just won and lost on, 2,000 or 3,000 votes in Florida. These things can.
And they're still not sure who actually won the election.
Yeah, they're still not sure who actually won. Yeah, but you see what I mean. And I mean, we found in England, for example, in some parliamentary seats that the previous election, they were like won and lost on like 100 votes or a tiny number of votes. And what we found in the run up to an election when we've been campaigning, we might, for example, in that particular constituency or area, we might get the Green Party's candidate to sign up. And then the other candidates see that, and then the Liberal Democrat signs up, and then the Labour Party candidate signs up, and then the Conservative Party candidate signs up because they are afraid of losing out to the others. Right. So in the end, quite often we've ended up with all 4 or 5 competing candidates having signed the pledge 2 or 3 weeks before the election day. So whoever wins the seat, we win an extra member of parliament. So it's really a way of doing politics and voting that transcends party political divides and allows us as citizens to use to give expression to our desire for global solutions and global action through our national vote in quite a powerful way.
Perhaps, Gayatri could step in here. Just very keen to know what is the approach that you are planning to take in India? I think I know it's absolutely still something that you've recently started, but I'm very keen to understand what is the approach that you think would work, and how do you think you want to?
Yeah. So most importantly, first and foremost, like what you rightly mentioned in the previous question, is only when there would be a substantial amount of voting bank or a person who would say that we want somebody who would align with Simpol, and only then we will cast our votes in their favor. So for someone to be able to say that, they need to have awareness about Simpol. So right now, we want Simpol to be a sort of a wake-up call for us civilians, for young people who are thinking about these chaotic issues like climate change or the environmental effects because of the various plastic issues that we have, and so on and so forth. Such other issues, we need to realize that it's not just our issue, or it's not just a national issue, and these issues, they sort of cross national boundaries, and that should be something that would enlighten people like me to understand that Simpol very easily and pragmatically provides a solution to this. So what foremost, my aim would be to have more awareness about Simpol and have civilians and voters really sign up to Simpol, and only then we would create, or will be able to create some sort of an expectation from our politicians that this is something that you should implement or should think of implementing, and that's the reason you should be signing on to this, and only then can we cast a vote in your favor. So that would be my strategy, to start with young minds, aspiring minds, to make a change for the issues that we're facing today, to know about Simpol, to align with Simpol, and then move things ahead into the parliamentary for India.
John, I think you must have faced. I think you must have and continue to face a lot of skepticism with regard to whether this is possible. In fact, there's a message even in the chat box. So I thought I'll bring it up straight away before. I think Shubham has also raised his hand. Shubham, you want to ask a question? Is that why you raised your hand?
Yes, sir. Actually, I had a query.
Yeah, I'll just finish this and then you could probably come in.
Yes, sir.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's the chat. The message in the chat that's come through also says, there are a couple actually. I may sound skeptical, even though the concern is genuine, and the concerns that have been expressed are appreciated. The solution seems a little utopian. Do you think it'll work? Is one question. I'll club this with another one that's also come through the chat. The idea of Simpol is a good one based on the practice of good democracy. I'm curious to know how the citizens in the US, for example, are responding to this call. Thank you. A couple of questions that I saw.
Yeah, well, yes, I completely understand the utopian criticism or comment. And I can remember many years ago when I first started Simpol, and I was very nervous to talk to people in a meeting or in a over coffee or whatever. And because I thought, well, if I start talking about global and simultaneous implementation, the first thing they're going to do is to call the doctor and have me removed to the mental hospital or something. But I think on the one hand, it sounds utopian, but on the other, I would say that people who make that criticism are simply showing themselves to be behind the curve. Global problems like COVID, climate change are here now. So Simpol is really just a very normal, logical response to that reality. And so that the criticism of utopianism is really just an indication of how far our consciousness has got to go to evolve to a truly realistic understanding of where we are. I would say so. I would turn that criticism around a little bit. But no, I do understand it. And let me also just say, Ramesh, that it's not that I think Simpol is the best idea in the world, or that I think it is guaranteed to work. I don't. All I'm saying is do we have a better idea? Because the established ways of solving global problems are simply not working. And so we need to be prepared, I think, to take a few risks with alternatives, because the biggest risk is that we do nothing and things completely fail. As far as the United States is concerned, I mean, we have quite a few supporters in the United States, but we haven't yet got any members of Congress or senators signed up yet, partly because it seems we haven't really got enough head of steam going among citizens yet for that to happen. So it's actually not a dissimilar situation to the one we have in India, where we really need much more citizen support to really to really raise our profile to the point where politicians feel that they need to listen to this.
Okay, I just have a follow-up on the same question. We used to talk of a flat world and how the world is increasingly becoming flat. But do you think, to some extent, the world is starting to become a little insular as well now? I think in the recent past, for example, you had a campaign like "Make America Great." Brexit itself is an example of how.
Yes.
I mean, you chose to break away from the.
Yes.
And when I say you, it's not. But I'm saying.
Not me personally, but.
Yeah, I know. So how do we then look to find areas of overlap and simultaneity in an increasingly fragmented world?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, Ramesh, because what we're seeing, I think, is two seemingly opposing forces. One is the force of fragmentation towards a more nationally focused world, and Brexit, Trump, and so forth. And the other is globalization itself, which is this more economic move towards a more integrated world. And these two things seem to us to be opposing, but actually they are, to my mind, linked in the sense that if you have a global economy, but you only have national governance and you have nations competing with each other destructively to attract capital, to attract jobs, to give tax breaks to the corporations and the rich, what you get is an increasingly unequal world. And the result of that is that people from the developing or poor countries are going to migrate to the richer countries. And then you're going to get a backlash from people in the richer countries against that mass migration, that mass immigration. And then you get the fragmentation you were talking about, Brexit, Trump, and so forth. So really the problems of mass migration and many of the issues that people on the right wing are worried about, their protection of their national identity or their cultural identity, they are under threat because we don't have global cooperation. We don't have governance at the same level, global level, as the economy. So if we bring governance back up, and you can tax the multinational corporations, you can tax the super rich and redistribute that wealth more equitably to developing countries, people will be much better able to make a decent living in their home country, which after all is what most people want to do anyway. And therefore, you will have a much more balanced world. That doesn't mean you stop people from migrating necessarily. It just means people, the pressures that pump large numbers of people from south to north or wherever really will no longer be there. And so, what we are trying to say with Simpol is that there is an aim that goes beyond either of the opposing arguments of build a wall or tear down the borders. Both of those arguments of the right and the left are obsolete. Neither of them will work. The only thing that will work is global cooperation, where we can regulate and tax the multinational entities and the super rich that move their capital through tax havens and what have you, so that they can, the proceeds of those taxes and can feed back to developing countries in a much more established, foreseeable, institutionalized way. And then you will see things will gradually balance in the world and will solve the problems like climate change and so forth. And then we won't need walls, and we won't need open borders either. So yes, I guess that's quite utopian, Ramesh, in a sense. When I listen to myself talking like that, but at the end of the day, I say, what's the alternative at the end?
I'll play the devil's advocate when I come to global corporations, but that will come. I'm just going to open it up for a couple of questions, I think. Shubham had a question. Shubham is a student of development in economics. So I think he had a question. Shubham, you could go ahead and ask your question. Keep it short and just go ahead and ask the question you wanted to ask.
Firstly, I would like to thank Sir for such an insightful and such a thought-provoking session and discourse. Sir, I had a query that as a Simpol aims for global cooperation and commitment towards a better society and larger welfare, but I also have a query that how Simpol stands apart from, there are various international organizations like UNDP, or there is the World Bank, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So how does Simpol stand apart from them? It was a query.
Okay, well Simpol is purely an organization of citizens. We are not, we are an association of individual citizens. That's all. We have no support from national governments. We are not tied to any particular corporation or nation. We don't accept any funding from any for-profit entity. So it's entirely up to us citizens. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less.
Okay, sir. So thank you, sir.
Thank you. I think Vijay had a question. Vijay, you would like to ask the question directly? You can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, thanks, Ramesh, for giving the opportunity. Thanks, John and Gayatri, for such a nice exploration. My question is, when the whole system is so fragmented, it's kind of more divided, all over the place, whether it's a globally, because global economic cooperation is also becoming more and more restrictive. And also in the Indian context, the whole thing is so caste-driven, fragmented, and deep corruption in the systems. How can Simpol can have a vision of cleaning up the system, because it's a huge problem across the globe, and the divide in terms of economic divide is widening every day, and people are not really addressing some of those issues. So what's your vision in terms of, it could be long term drawn, but what's your vision, how it can be figured out?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Interesting question, Vijay. Thank you. I mean, yes, things are incredibly fragmented at the moment, and yet global problems are going to be with us regardless. And so I think whether we live in a more unified world or in an increasingly fragmented world, we are still on this planet, or all these nations are still on the planet, whether they are individual working together or in the EU or out of the EU, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, we will still need to find solutions to global problems. So I think that there is an issue there that we have, that all nations will have to face eventually. The other thing I would say is that, so I'm just trying to think of your question now. Sorry, Vijay. Can you just repeat it again very briefly? Sorry.
Yeah, my question is more related to fragmented societies, deep corruption in the Indian context, right. and kind of my way, kind of a way, and highway kind of approach a lot of leaders are taking. So in that context, how can Simpol make a difference?
Yeah, I understand that. And Simpol, in a sense, the answer is, in the immediate sense, Simpol, or direct sense, Simpol can't make a difference to that. Because Simpol is really designed simply to deal with global level problems. Okay? It's not designed to interfere into the national affairs of any country. So if you have a caste system in India or deep corruption in India, that's not something Simpol can deal with. That is really something that you citizens of India have to face. So Simpol is not about interfering in the internal affairs of different nations. What it's about is creating a framework that enables all nations to solve the global problems that are common to all of us. But also, I would say that if nations cooperate, they will be in a position to deal with their national problems more effectively. So, for example, if nations can cooperate to raise the level of corporation tax globally, they will have more revenue to fund better public services at home. So I think there is an indirect way that Simpol would help individual or the internal affairs of individual nations, but it's not really designed to do that directly. And personally, I think that's a good thing, because if Simpol or any other entity, the United Nations or any other, tried to set it up as a kind of world government that sort of usurped national governments, I think nobody would support that. And I certainly wouldn't. So I think it's important that Simpol is understood as a tool for dealing with a very specific level of problems, and that's the global level problems, nothing else. Anything below that level is for nations to deal with independently.
There's also one other question that I'll ask from the chat that's come up, and then I'll move to the global corporates. And it says issues like levying carbon tax and cleaning the oceans needs a global management system. So can Simpol enter through issues rather than just a pledge of global cooperation? I think the question is asking, why don't you attack the issues rather than asking for a pledge of global cooperation?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you, Anita, for that. I mean, as I said, Simpol eventually will consist of specific detailed policies. But obviously, you'll understand from everything I've said so far that this is not something that's going to happen tomorrow. And so to try to have detailed policies already today, when implementation may only occur in some years' time, by which time those policy details might be out of date, just wouldn't make sense. And so what we do is you'll see on our website, we make a list of global issues that are likely to require the Simpol approach. So we do identify those issues, but what we haven't done is gone further to sort of talk about detailed policies. And so really the pledge that we're asking politicians to make at this stage is only a pledge in principle. It's if a politician who signs the pledge says, I am ready to implement the simultaneous policy and to enter into negotiations with all other countries as to what those policies will be, what the details will be, and when we will all implement it. Because you've got to get politicians into the room in principle before you can start to talk about detailed policies. And so that's really why we, at the moment, we really restrict ourselves just to headline issues rather than going further at this stage. But I think as more citizens join Simpol and as more politicians sign up, and as that momentum builds, we'll gradually shift our emphasis more and more towards the policy development side. So I think that will come, hopefully, but I think we're not there yet. We really need more citizens to be supporting the principle and more politicians to be supporting the principle before we then go to the next stage.
You brought up this. There is a question that I'll go to the participants in a short while. I think Professor Giridhar wanted to ask a question. I'll go to him next. So, before that, I just wanted to quickly touch base, and if you could quickly answer that. You talked about global corporations. We know for a fact that large global corporations, particularly the corporations that run social media, for example, have started to influence policy, governance, and global issues. But at the same time, the argument that can also be made about large global corporations that you spoke about is also that they are the primary wealth creators. And therefore, wealth creation is as critical to global growth as is anything else. So how do you, so when you say that, so this argument about, equitable distribution of wealth, so when we talk of equal opportunities, don't you think that when opportunities are equal, I mean, I'm not saying that opportunities are equal at the moment, but when the whole the business, the whole capitalist markets are in a way designed for a few people to go to the top. So how do we reconcile this with what you're saying? Right?
It's very easy, Ramesh. It's called social democracy, basically. I mean, Simpol, I'm not saying, and Simpol is not suggesting that there should be an end to capitalism and an end to self-interest. No. All we're saying is that global entities who today are able to escape without paying almost any tax simply because they can shift their operations, move them around, or they can play one government off against another, that needs to stop. So we're not talking about breaking up Google or breaking up global corporations. What we're talking about is properly regulating them and properly taxing them at the global level, so that we're not removing everything. We are simply removing the bad bits, if you see what I mean. And that's what individual nations, in the decades prior to globalization, when nations were a little bit more independent and able to manage their own affairs, that was the process. We had capitalism, but we had a strong taxes and redistributions to the poor, so that it didn't stop people from becoming rich, but it did keep extreme wealth inequality in some kind of proportion. And that's really what we're talking about. I think that, generally from a historical point of view, the Cold War taught us that the market economies are the best way to run economies, not communism. What we need to learn now is that governance needs to be on the same scale as the economy. The economy is global, and governance needs to cooperate. International cooperation needs to be upgraded to the same level. And when you have those two things in balance, then I think we will all get a much better world, a much fairer world. There'll still be rich people, but there will also be not nearly so many people down the bottom starving and in extreme poverty.
Professor Giridhar, you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you, Ramesh, and thank you, Mr. John. Actually, I was the one who, I did not mind to criticize when I used the term utopian, but certainly someone like me who is generally considered a sort of a hopeless optimist or a very serious optimist kind of a thing. What I'm trying to understand is I went through the website before joining this conversation, website of Simpol. So if I crudely simplify the basic model which you are trying to bring as a solution is the global level citizens force, a global level citizens movement, so that it's a democratic kind of an association of the global citizens trying to sort of amplify this serious concern which you have very correctly raised. So for this, it has to succeed as a democratic movement itself. And as a democratic movement, it has to succeed means the number of well-meaning people across the globe have to outnumber the number of ill-meaning people. And is this going to happen is a very valid concern, which should not stop someone like me becoming a part of the movement. But at the end of the day, when you are spending your time, energy, and then a very serious being part of such a great global cause, does it work? Is a very genuine concern.
Yes, GP, I understand that, and I didn't mean to. Perhaps I was a little bit harsh in my response, but no, I completely understand what you're saying, and I think the other point to note is that when if as a citizen you sign on to Simpol, you're just signing on. It just takes a couple of minutes. And so we are not necessarily, you can get much more involved in Simpol if you wish, and we need volunteers. And obviously we need, there's a lot of work to be done. But at the minimum, for a citizen, just signing on to the campaign just takes a couple of minutes, and you don't necessarily need to do anything more than that. So we're not asking you necessarily to go out on the streets or to spend an awful lot of time. Simpol is very simple in that because it is using the votes, and politicians cannot ignore votes. They can ignore petitions, they can ignore protests, they can ignore all of these other things, but they cannot ultimately ignore votes. And therefore we are using a very potent tool, and it doesn't actually take individual citizens much time to lend their support. So it's really, we're not saying just support Simpol and do nothing else. We're saying support Simpol and do, all the other actions or other campaigns that you feel are important to you too. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just only wondering, this is a democratic global citizens movement. And for it to succeed, I'm only concerned that the well-meaning people across the globe have to outnumber ill-meaning people. And that has to happen. So how will it happen is the only doubt, but the doubt should not prevent anyone like me to be part of this Simpol. But this doubt persists. That's how it is.
Yeah, no, I understand that, DP, and I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, in terms of, you know, the well-meaning people outnumbering the others, I would say that there's an evolutionary process going on here. And that is that at the moment, or at the early part of the process, you will get the well-meaning people such as everybody here who might support and sign on to Simpol, and I hope you do. But I think the one of the ways that cooperation works is when the water gets up to here, right? Okay. People might not be, you know, you might have someone who's completely against global cooperation. You might have some corporate executive, perhaps, who is interested in keeping governments separate and in carrying on playing his game of avoiding tax or whatever. But I think, you know, once the crisis, the level of crisis in the world gets up round the necks of those sort of people too, they will realize that either they have to cooperate with something like Simpol, or their business will just be destroyed in the collapse. You know, so I think there is a, cooperation happens when out of necessity, if you like. So I think I think that ultimately, even many people who would today be implacably against something like Simpol might eventually change their minds simply because they'll see that it's in their interest to change their minds.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
I just have one question about, I understand I understand why this is a citizen-centric approach. But again, like I need to play the devil's advocate here. So at the grassroots level, you know, in our homes, you know, all of us are individualistic. We are individuals, you know, we like our individual freedom. So, I'll just club a couple of questions. So should simultaneous policy be a top-down approach instead of a bottom-up approach like you're talking about? And is it practical to expect governments and politicians to agree to an integrated and simultaneous policy shift on, even if it's on areas of mutual, global concerns, when their primary concerns are to address the needs of the local population? They need to get elected. And so how does that play out?
Yeah, well, Simpol in a sense is bottom up and top down. So it's bottom up in the sense that it's driven from below by citizens and their votes and the decisions that Simpol supporters, their preferences about what the policy content of Simpol should be. So that's very bottom up. But ultimately, we're driving politicians and governments to implement it, and that'll be top down. So it's really what democracy is all about. It's just bringing it more to the global level. So I would say it's top down and bottom up. I mean, as far as politicians are concerned, Ramesh, I think that, you know, again, we've seen this, I think, partly with COVID, but also I think you will have seen recently this almost global agreement on a minimum level of corporation tax that Biden was pushing, and I think has now been agreed by about 150 countries. Why is that happening now? It's happening because the water level of COVID is up around the government's neck. They're all borrowed up to their eyeballs in debt. They need more revenue, and that's driving the cooperation, right? So I think that politicians, you know, as these global challenges kind of keep hitting us more and more, national politicians are going to see it as in their national interest to cooperate to solve them, because if they don't, we're all finished, you know. So I think we're in a time now where nationalism and independence is very fashionable, and Brexit and all of this sort of thing. But I think that, you know, that's really a prelude to you know, because you can be as independent as you like, but at the end of the day, global warming's still there. You know, mass migration's still there. COVID's still there. You know, nations are going to have to come back together to solve these problems. And what Simpol is there for is really to make sure that we citizens are, have a proper input into this, and that we hopefully manage the process rather than it being managed managed by nation states alone. And that, Ramesh, would be really top down, because then citizens will just not get any say in what is implemented. So I think that's another aspect of Simpol, which I think is very important, is that, I think it was an American politician, Mike Enzi, who said, if you're not sitting at the table, then you're on the menu.
Yeah, correct.
And I think that's the point. If we don't use something like Simpol, we citizens, to make sure that we're sitting at the table, we'll be on the menu.
We have time for just one more question. So I'm going to, we are both, both our countries' cricket is a passion. So I'm going to bowl a googly at you now. So let's see how
you did a pretty good job at the recent test matches, I know.
So today is October the 2nd, which is Gandhi Jayanti. So, and Gandhi was a proponent of the Swadeshi policy, which you could say it's a nationalistic policy. Swadeshi means use your local produce. So he's being nationalistic in a support for locally produced goods in principle against the tenets of simultaneous policy.
Not at all, no. I think that localization all over the world is vital. But I think to actually achieve localization, local production and consumption, paradoxically, you need global cooperation. So, for example, let me give you a very crude example. Say, for example, we had a simultaneous policy which increased taxes on long-distance transportation. What would the effect would be? The effect would be that long-distance transportation became much more expensive. That means local production and consumption would become much more competitive. That would give a boost to local production and consumption everywhere. And on top of that, it would reduce pollution. It would reduce health problems from emissions from transport and so forth. So that but forget about all of that. So I think that we're living in a world today where I like to think Gandhi would be a supporter of Simpol. He probably would have invented something like Simpol, because it's actually just the global expression of what he was talking about in the national context with India, I think.
So I think you played that perfectly well.
Sorry?
I think you played that perfectly well. So it's not actually true that the English can't play spin. So.
It's not what, sorry?
No, I said you played that perfectly well. So it's not actually true that the English can't play spin.
No, well, yeah, I think they're deciding on the outcome of the test match today, aren't they?
They are. Right? I think, yeah, they're deciding on the 10th. I don't think they can come up with any solution that will satisfy either side.
No. Well, maybe that's another one for Simpol then, Ramesh.
It's been an absolute pleasure, John, Gayatri. We've been doing these conversations. We've been doing it for quite some time now, and this has been we've been exploring subjects across the board. We've talked about culture. We've talked about so many things. And, we've talked about politics. We've talked about media in India, and today we've talked about global policy. But we'll bring more such conversations. I want to take this opportunity to thank both of you on behalf of the Vivekananda Institute for Leadership Development, as well as the Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement, for coming on board and sharing your thoughts with us. And we hope we will stay engaged on these and take this forward. So,
well, thank you very much, Ramesh. And if I may I encourage all of you to please give Gayatri your support. You can sign on to Simpol and be in touch with Gayatri directly. And she needs your help, and this is something we all have to do together. You know, it's not something that can be, you know, is already cooked. We need to cook it together. I do hope you'll sign up and be in touch. And the website is simpol.org, and I think our Indian website is in.simpol.org. So
just to add, yes. I mean, even though we're stopping the conversation here, if you guys want to join in another discussion and perhaps debate this further, and then perhaps we will find more insights to what we plan to do and how this really plays for India, then please do reach out. And if you really find this benefiting, then I would urge you to sign up and sort of help me form a team so that we can have good things happening for Simpol India to eventually take this ahead and probably even have that utopia.
As quickly as possible.
As quickly as possible.
The other utopia, Ramesh, is that we want Britain, we want England to beat India at cricket. That's the other utopia that I'm hoping for.
Yeah, you might want to try beating India in India. I think that's that's the. So it's been a pleasure. Next week we'll have Mr. Kollegala Sharma, who will be joining us. He is, I said right at the beginning, so he's one of the earliest people to start podcasting, and that too podcasting on science. He recently touched 800 episodes on the trot. He's taken a break now. So, and he also is the first one who did it in the regional language. So it would be, that would also be a very interesting conversation that we'll have next week. Next week would be with Kollegala Sharma. So please do join us, and thank you everyone. Thank you everyone. And you can also catch this on YouTube. I will share the link and send it out across all social media platforms. Thank you. Have a great weekend, and thank you everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ramesh.